Good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Loiza, the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences here at Minnesota State University, Mankato. I'd like to welcome you all to the 41st Annual College of Social and Behavioral Sciences Frontier Forum Lecture, Enhancing Memory and Attention Through the Science of Learning, presented by Dr. Carla Lassande from our Department of Psychology. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Let me run through a couple of quick items before we get started. First, closed captioning is available for today's presentation. To enable this feature, click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen and then choose Show Subtitles. Second, we will take questions following Dr. Lassande's presentation. Please enter your questions using the Q&A feature. You can enter your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will address them at the end. 41 years ago, Dean Bill Webster initiated this lectureship to celebrate all of the scholarly activity in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. It has become a well-known and respected event in our college and university. Today, we welcome Dr. Lassande, who was selected as this year's presenter by the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences Research and Teaching Committee. Thank you very much to all of the committee members for their contributions to the Frontier Forum. Before we introduce today's speaker, I do want to say thank you to all of the students, faculty, staff, and university administrators for attending today's event, including Dr. Richard Davenport, President of Minnesota State University, Mankato. We are privileged to have Dr. Davenport join us today to say a few words on behalf of the university. President Davenport.
Okay, so I just got the word. I got a text message that you are able to hear me. I just want to, at this point, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Chip Panahan, who's the chair of the Department of Psychology, who's going to introduce today's speaker. Anyway, good luck, everybody. This promises to be a really exciting presentation. And thank you all for joining us.
Am I good to go? Good morning, everyone. Thank you, President Davenport, distinguished guests in attendance via Zoom and here in Ostrander Auditorium. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker this morning, Dr. Carla Lassande. Having worked with Carla my entire time here at MSU Mankato, I've seen her rise from the rank of assistant professor to full professor. In my opinion, Carla is the quintessential full professor. She's excelled in teaching, scholarly activities, professional development, focus on student growth and development, and service to the university and community. For example, this year, Carla received the Distinguished Faculty Scholar Award here at MSU. In 2019, she received the Walter D. Mink Outstanding Teaching Award presented by the Minnesota Psychological Association. In addition, she has received the Outstanding Undergraduate Advising Award from the College of Social Behavior Sciences and the Outstanding Undergraduate Mentor of the Year Award by the Undergraduate Research Center. I could deliver an hour-long lecture on all of her accomplishments, but for the sake of time, we'll stop here. It is my honor to call Carla a colleague and to have been given the opportunity to introduce her this morning. Please join me in welcoming the 41st Annual Frontier Forum Lecturer, Dr. Carla Lassande.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so glad that you've joined us online and in the audience today. Thank you, President Davenport, for hanging in there with us, and we are grateful for your continued support of academic excellence, research, and scholarship here at the university. Thank you, Dean Loiza, for your support of the Frontier Forum and keeping it moving along in spite of some difficult circumstances in 2020. And thank you, Dr. Panahan. You two are a wonderful colleague, and I'm grateful for your introduction. Today I want to talk a little bit about some of my work, some of my research. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I've been working at Minnesota State University for 13 years. Time goes by really fast. As a cognitive psychologist, my interest lies in looking at human behavior and how we think. The problem with how we think is we can't look inside our brain and say, yes, she's thinking, he's doing this. So my work has been supported by the institution, by my students, in two very important ways. The first way is that I'm so lucky to be able to understand learning and memory, and it's so helpful, not just in my research, but it applies to my teaching. It's allowed to inform my teaching and make me a better scholar in the classroom. The second reason why I love this work is my students. Students really enjoy learning how to be effective researchers and learners, and today I hope you can see the joy that has come out of the research with my students. So today I'll be talking to you about how memory foundations and attention foundations can help enhance learners both in and outside of the classroom. I wonder if you remember what it's like to be curious. Perhaps as a child you were very much into animals and you could tell anyone anything about an animal, or you have all the baseball stats so that you could drive your parents absolutely crazy. I want to show you what it looks like to be a curious learner now. Take a look. Now, I wonder if you understand, do our students look like that in the classroom? When children are out in the middle of a field or a forest and they're playing, they really are engaging in curious learning. A few years ago, I took my son, Callan, who is now 8, to a kindergarten field trip in an apple orchard. In that orchard, we learned how to taste apples, smell apples, and very delicately and carefully plucking the apples from the tree. Yes, you can damage an apple, so don't do it. From plucking to packing and looking at the making of pies at the orchard, I watched my son learn about apples in a way that I wish my college students would embrace learning. So today, I want you to think about how curiosity can really emblazon our learning. But first, we're going to learn a little bit more about attention. In order to understand learning and memory, one of the first principles toward learning is to be able to pay attention. I want you to imagine a metaphor for attention, and that metaphor is a spotlight. As there's a spotlight coming down on me now, attention has 3 important properties. The first is, imagine a spotlight illuminating me. It's able to select. You too are able to select your attention, and I hope those people who are watching at home are still paying attention to me. That's a really good sign. We've got 10 minutes of good attention, so I'm within that window. We also know that attention is shiftable. For example, if Dr. Panahan started giving the speech all of a sudden, maybe the spotlight would shift so that it's divided into 2. And the spotlight is also divisible. Attention works in these ways, and it's really important for us to hone in on what it is that attention does for our learning. I wonder if you remember the childhood books, Where's Waldo? Perhaps you remember looking for Waldo, who was wearing a shirt and a funny hat, and that shirt and hat was usually red and white stripes. We're going to play a version of this, and that's called Where's Stomper? Now, Stomper, if you're not familiar, is our maverick, esteemed mascot. My 4-year-old loves Stomper. We have about 3 stuffed animals in the house, but I can tell you he won't go near Stomper in any way during a hockey game. So here I'm asking you to select Stomper from the crowd. So if you're online, you're going to have an easier time looking for Stomper because your screen is right in front of you. Now, if I'm going to help the people in the audience, raise your hand in the audience if you've seen Stomper, just so I can get a sense of how the audience might be doing at home. We have almost everyone recognizing Stomper. So here's what you need to do. I would suggest that you look in the middle of the seats. If you found the middle, look just up from the glass where the hockey puck is meant to not go over and hit the audience. And then finally, I would tell you that Stomper is is casually planted on a fan's lap. So have you seen Stomper yet? The awareness of seeing this image is a good example of how in a crowd or an environment that's really busy, it can be hard for us to pay attention to just one thing. Here's another example of attention. If you look at the shapes, you'll notice that there's two important features. There is the color of the shape and the shape in and of itself. So if I ask you to go ahead and read the shapes that you see in front of you, you don't have a problem with that. So taking the first line, you can go circle and square, triangle, circle, and triangle again. And if I ask you to then focus on the color, that's equally easy for you. I want you to try this next attention task. This is called the Stroop task. What happens here is you have two pieces of information, just like with the shapes. However, this time you have the semantic or the meaning of the word, red, and the meaning of the word blue, but you also have the color that the word is being presented in. So go ahead and try the first line. You'll see that it's quite easy. Red, blue, orange, purple. The second line, no problem either. Orange, blue, green, and red. Get to the third line and beyond, and try now to not say the meaning of the word, but say the color of the font the word is presented in. I'll give you a moment to do that at home. So when students are in my class, I've had students stand up and try to do this before, and they get very anxious, and you might understand why. It's because of two principles of attention. Attention is made up of automatic and controlled processes. For example, when you're driving, you can drive, you can enjoy getting from point A to point B, and sometimes you don't have to pay attention at all to what you're doing. So driving is automatic, just like the meaning of a word is automatic. So when you look at that third line, you have to say green, but the semantic representation is screaming at you saying blue. This is a good example of attention. We have to select, we have to divide, and sometimes we have to suppress irrelevant information. Now, my 4-year-old would do an amazing job at this because he hasn't learned how to read. And that just gives you a sense of what we're able to pay attention to. Here's another test of attention. I hope you're not tired yet. This is called a trail-making test, and it is one of a formative way to assess people's attention. This may remind you of connect the dots if you've done those as a child or as an adult. So what you're being asked to do now is numerically trace your finger, you can do this at home on the screen, from 1 all the way to 25. And you want to imagine if you had a pen and you were doing this. So in the audience and at home, try to get from 1 to 25. How'd you do? If your cognition was being assessed at this moment, we would be taking a measure of your reaction time, how long it took you, and we'd also look to see if you had to lift your pen up and if you made mistakes. Think this is easy? Of course, there's an enhanced version. This is called Trail Making B. Now you have to divide your attention between two pieces of information. So yes, you're going to look for the numbers in order, but you're also going to look for A, B, C, D, and so on. But the trick is you have to move from number to letter, going up in order, either numerically or alphabetically. So 1A, then 2B. See if you can make this work. If you could only see the people in the audience, I bet it's even more entertaining to watch the individuals do this at home. So don't spill your coffee. It's okay. This is even more interesting if the cat is now entered the computer screen, as we see so often on Zoom meetings. Again, if you were testing your cognition, the two things that you're looking for are the speed that it takes you to complete this task and the accuracy. And it's not easy. We would be looking to see how well you did, and that would be a measure of your ability to focus or pay attention. Here's another good example. Many of you who've taken intro psychology will know something called attentional blindness. Let's take a look at this clip.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
I wonder if you were able to accurately get 16 passes. Anyone in the room? Okay, no one in the room, so now you can absolve yourself if you're online. This is a really well-known phenomenon, the invisible gorilla, so much so that Daniel Simons, the original researcher, has written a book. I really encourage you to read it, especially if you want to know how attention applies to really important societal issues like eyewitness testimony. Turns out memory is really well flawed, and this has to do with whether we can pay attention. In your own lives, if you see a fender bender, hopefully you don't, but if you do see one later on today, and suddenly you're asked, what is the make, the model, or the license plate of the car, people often overestimate their ability to remember these things. And sometimes they even lie, just because they want to be good servants. So next time you wonder how well you're paying attention, think about the invisible gorilla. Here's another example of what we call attentional blindness. What I'd like you to do at home is acknowledge to yourself when you see a large change in the environment. So here in the audience, go ahead and raise your hand when you see the change. So we only have one person in the audience that has seen the change. It's not a big audience, but so if I would ask this audience member, what would you say to the viewers at home about how to see this change? Okay, so imagine looking just to the left of the kayaker's nose. You'll see that the landscape shifts. So everyone's laughing, and hopefully you're laughing at home. Maybe you've asked the dog to do this with you now. The fun thing about attentional blindness is once we see something and it's pointed out to us, we can't unsee it. It's annoying now, and you're ready for me to change the slide, especially our audience member who got it right away. So I'm going to give you a more difficult task here. Here's our esteemed coffee shop in the CSU called Jasmine's. There's going to be one small change. I want you to see if you can pick up the change, and here in the audience, go ahead and raise your hand when you see it. I have one audience member, and it's my husband, and he's seen the slide before, so he's lying. Anyway, we have to have a good laugh, right? So here's what I would need you to do. This is a lot like what we do in the classroom. We have to give people contextual cues so that they can figure out what they can't see. So what I'd ask you to do is to imagine right above the cash register, suddenly your coffee is ready. Now that coffee mug that you see blinking back and forth is really important to see, even though it's one small change. And my husband said, that's not fair. That's such a small change. But he does really like coffee, so we'll see. Anyway, These are attentional blindness tasks, and what makes them really interesting is how you're affected after you've seen the change. I promise I'll take it off the screen for you in a moment. But there's also a really fun concept called change, blindness, blindness. It's very redundant, but essentially what it means is when you ask an audience of people, are you going to notice the change? 50% say absolutely. And that 50% won't notice. So we have really high confidence in our ability to learn and remember, and maybe we shouldn't be so confident. All right, learning a little bit about attention is important. Now I want to talk to you about the properties of memory that are very essential for learning. So again, we have to use metaphors when we talk about memory because we can't go into your mind, although we have great technology in neuroscience that allows us to understand the parts of the brain that do these functions. But for a cognitive psychologist like myself, we try to talk about the behavior. I want you to imagine yourself typing a paper on a computer. We've all done that maybe more times than we would like. This is a way to think about the encoding process of memory. You're taking information and you're writing it in ways that when you're thinking of something, you're hopefully writing it to your internal screen. This is something we call short-term memory. So the encoding process is what has to happen first. As you're typing away, you should be keying numbers and letters and you see them on the screen. Just like you want to be able to understand that in your own memory. The next part of that is the storage phase. How many of you have been writing a paper, I've done this myself, and you just won't stop to hit the save button? Why won't we do that? It's such an inconvenience, right? I can't hit the save button. That's actually a good metaphor for our own storage of information. A lot of times when we're learning, we're resistant to do it well. So just like we might lose a section of our paper if the lights go out and there's a power surge, our lights often go off in our own memory in how we're trying to learn. The last fundamental part of memory is what we call retrieval. If you think of retrieval, the best example I can give you is in graduate school, my research mentor had a border collie named Riley. This border collie loved to retrieve the Frisbee. So we'd go out almost every day and we'd play. And I bet, 100% of the time that dog would find the Frisbee and bring it back to me. Unfortunately, retrieval in memory does not work so easily. The Frisbee is out there, right? It's the concept, the name, the idea that we're looking for, but it's not coming back because it was not stored properly. So the dog is much better than our own brains at retrieval. Limitations of memory are important for you to understand. A lot of us think we have a terrible memory. There are two general types of memory. What you should know about them is, again, you can't open up your mind and say, here is exactly where short-term memory is, or here's exactly where long-term memory is. These are circuits and neurons that work together. But to describe short-term memory, I want you to think of your conscious experience. A good way to imagine this is if you're walking down the hall, you're thinking about your breakfast, you're thinking about getting to the next place, and someone says, hey, Carla, how are you doing? Immediately, that voice becomes part of your short-term memory, and it knocks out what you're currently thinking of. So short-term memory has something called capacity. We can only put so much in our thinking minds at the same time. This is also true when we're thinking. So I could be teaching a class, and I could start thinking about lunch. Then I might say pizza, and before you know it, I'm off topic, and I'm thinking about the last time I had pizza, what kind of pizza I like. And this all takes the voice of my short-term memory or my conscious experience. This is quite different than long-term memory. Long-term memory is considered to be of unlimited capacity. And no, that doesn't mean that we're all geniuses and we remember things all the time. What it means is that we have not fundamentally found a way to say, yep, my brain is full. So if we have normal cognitive function, we are able to learn and learn and learn new information all the time. A good way to think about short-term memory is to think of a workbench or a desk. I want you to close your eyes, or maybe you are at your desk and you know what it looks like. Imagine what you need to do when you want to work effectively. For me, I want everything to be lined up, to be neat, to be clean. Now I realize not everyone has to have the same desk preferences that I do, But thinking of a desk like memory is the more you pile on your desk, the harder it is for you to focus on that one task that you might have to get done today. So this helps us understand that capacity is really important for memory. I tested your attention, but now you're waiting for me to test your memory, aren't you? One of the most popular ways to test memory is through something called the digit span task. Digits are numbers. We can do this with letters or words and so on. So what you'll need to do at home or in the audience is, you probably don't have paper handy, you might at home, so go ahead and take out a piece of paper to jot on, or you can use your own recall and just hold the information in your head the best that you can. A number is going to appear, then a blank slide. When you see the blank slide, I want you to try to recall the number that was just presented. Here we go. Can you remember that number? We'll give them a moment at home to write it down. I wonder if they're behaving and they're actually doing the task. They're just like the students. You have no idea what they're doing. Let's move on to another number. Here you go. Go ahead and try to remember that number. We can keep upping this, making it more challenging. Let's do at least one more number. Okay. Going back through the numbers, you can assess how you did. So we started with 3156034. I don't know if you know this, but we have a capacity of what's called George Miller's 7 plus or minus 2. Now, 7 plus or minus 2 is broken down into something called units. So it might be letters, it might be numbers, it could be something totally different, like equations. But the point is that we have a capacity, and once we reach that capacity, information gets kicked out. Phone numbers are 7 digits for a reason. And, you know, we're in the kind of world where, think of how many 7-digit phone numbers you can actually remember. I could probably tell you 3 of the most important people in my life. So the digit span task is a way to measure your capacity. And as you get further and further advanced, most people have to do what we call chunking in cognitive research. And chunking, my students wonder, is this an obscene word when I say it? No, it just means that you're taking the numbers and you're grouping them. We read like this, after all. We take letters, we form words, and our words form sentences. Okay. Now, this is really challenging. Short-term memory is not just about storage. So if I told you to remember a 10-digit number, and then I asked you to remember it for 10 minutes and I'll pay you $100, I bet you could do it. You would silence your phone, you would focus, you might even go to a room where no one is so that you can remember that number. But the point is, we don't have the satisfaction of holding information in short-term memory. We actually do things while we're holding information. So if someone's talking to you while you're trying to read, the TV's on, and that's why we talk about short-term memory also as working memory. So these two terms are actually one and the same. This will make you a little uncomfortable at home. If you're in your pajamas, so it's okay. You can be a little uncomfortable. This is called an operation span test. In the operation span test, what you're going to do is you're going to see a math problem. I hope I haven't lost you already. What you want to do is you want to calculate the answer for each problem. So for example, you would say 1 plus 4 plus 3 minus 2. In your mind, you say 6. However, what I want you to remember is the last digit of that equation. Now, don't cheat. We have to make sure you're actually doing the math. Otherwise, the experiment won't work. There's going to be 3 equations, and each equation will come up on the screen, and you will pause through all of them. At the very end of the 3 equations, I'll have you write down the last digit in each of them. Take a deep breath. This is going to be hard. Here we go. I can't imagine you're vigorously writing down those numbers. And the point being is, as you're trying to remember the last digit, new information is continually bombarding your short-term memory, making it really hard to keep that number in that limited capacity. I give my students series of these, and they get real, like the dagger eyes that come after maybe the third set of numbers. So we're going to run a little poll for all of you at home, and I think this is a great way for you to get a little levity and try to engage with us. So the first poll we're going to put up here in just a moment. Let's see how slick we're going to do with our technology now. Okay, so at home what you are seeing is, I believe my memory compared to others is blank. And it's fun for us here in the live audience because we can see what you're saying and we can't actually poll ourselves. Okay. So as the numbers come in, and this is a great time to see how many people on the webinar are actually paying attention. It's a good way for me in the classroom, now that we are doing more Zoom lectures, to be like, oh, where are the rest of the 30 people? But you've done a pretty good job, and you can see from the results that most of you, the majority, almost 60%, believe you have an average memory. This is so good. I'm glad to see that. So we can go ahead and close that particular poll up. Now the idea is that we all see ourselves usually as average or above average. That's great. It's actually something in research called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect goes that when you rate yourself on some trait like driving or your ability to do math equations, we actually believe that we are better than average. So the average student thinks they're better than average. The average faculty member thinks they're better than average. And the fun thing about that, in terms of a normal distribution, is that we can't all be average or above average. But it is interesting that even after testing your memory, you feel pretty good about being average. Okay. We're going to get back here, I think, in just a moment. The fun thing about this semester in 2020, it resonates with the word flexibility. We all have to take on a good deal of flexibility. So while they are working on the next part of the talk, when you think about your memory, a lot of people think, well, I have a terrible memory. I refer to this idea as my airplane conversation. If I'm traveling in a typical year, going to conferences, and people say, oh, what do you do? My first hurdle that I have to get over is when I tell them I study psychology, they reel back and think I'm analyzing them. Now, just so you know, most psychologists are not clinicians. My hat's off to those who are, because they're amazing. But as an experimentalist, I then say, well, actually, no. I don't do clinical work, and I don't assess behaviors, but I do experiments with students. So when I tell them that and I study memory, their usual expression is, but I have a terrible memory. So if you feel that way, I guess they don't, because they think they have an average memory. So what I was interested in my research is looking at cognitive training programs to see if basic memory instruction is actually better than some of these multi-million-dollar industries in what we call the cognitive training industry. So cognitive training is a big industry, and you actually might have heard of one of these called Lumosity. So if we can get up the second poll. Oh, let's see. Almost. Good. So at home, you're seeing the second poll. When it comes to improving your memory, you have tried an online training program, you've tried to use techniques on your own, or you've never tried to improve your memory. So we're looking at how people respond here in the audience. So give a moment or two for everything to get smoothed out. And so you can see at home that the largest proportion have never tried to improve their memory. And this is pretty similar with what my students tell me. We do notice that there are flaws with our learning and thinking, but we're really not sure what to do about it. Okay. So I'm going to just rest assured that somewhere at home you can read the things that might be going on in the background. And I'll continue to move forward. I was interested in this question. What would happen if students use an online cognitive training program? In my human memory course, which I teach to juniors and seniors, I had two different classes. One class of students got typical instruction in the course. So they learned about attention, they learned about memory, and I gave them an assessment. It actually included the digit span and the operation span that you did earlier, and some other things. And I assessed them on this particular set of questions at 3 occasions during the semester. I then did this with the class. They had all of the same components as the class, except they did Lumosity. And Lumosity, it doesn't matter what the name is of the training program, but it's a training program you can spend about $30 a month on. So we were able to use a grant to get the students the program. And they did training activities 3 times a week for about 15 minutes each day. And they really liked this. It's like gaming in the middle of class. Let's see. Okay. So what I'm interested in here is wondering how the students who had the course versus the students who had the course plus the training would do on the memory assessment at the beginning compared to the end of the class. All right. One of the assessments in their battery was to remember faces. Now, I know you all love remembering names. I, too, can be bad at it when I'm not paying attention, and that's the key. So here is an example of one of the features of their test, and this is exactly what they saw. So they were asked to memorize or commit to memory these names and faces, and I'm not going to give you 10 minutes because we don't have that kind of time. So just think about how you might do this, the kinds of things that you might pay attention to. And why this is important, I tell my students, is if you're going to a job interview, you better be willing and ready to remember the people that you meet at that job interview. So face recognition and name recognition is a very important life skill. So imagine you had 10 minutes. Now, the students would be given a piece of paper that looks like this, and they would be asked to come up with as many of the names as they can. And I would give them points if they had partial responses. So maybe they had the first name or the last name. It's a very, very challenging task, as you can see. All right. So the big reveal is what happened in these two different groups of students. Well, there were significant changes on the memory assessment, but there was no difference in either class. So what we know is that class instruction on memory and attention can have important benefits when it comes to memory that Lumosity did not bolster. So there were no additional benefits from doing the cognitive training program. However, when students were asked if they enjoyed the cognitive training program, they really, really enjoyed it. They love it. And they would recommend it to a friend, even though they said it didn't improve their memory. So 69% of the students who had the course only felt like their memory had improved by the end of the class. That was a self-report. And then only 39% of the students who were in the Lumosity class. So doing something extra skewed their perception in a way of whether their memory improved, but yet they still will tell other people to do it. We should buyer beware when it comes to our own perceptions. Okay. So we're going to launch, fingers crossed, a third poll. We're going to ask you a question about learning. All right, so the question about learning is, you are more likely to learn when your teacher uses examples in line with your preferred learning style. So you've got true or false. People are still responding. That's good. I haven't lost everybody. All right. So this is how the response is borne out in the data. This is actually a huge misconception of learning. You should not figure out what students' learning styles are and then cater to their learning styles. This doesn't mean that students can't decide what works for them when they're studying on their own, but it makes no sense for a teacher to do things visually, auditorily, kinetically, and so on. So what you should be doing as an educator is asking, how is it that the general person should learn this material? So a chemistry student is going to learn chemistry in a way where they're actually applying the chemicals and doing the experiment. All right, let's go right forward to poll number 4. Okay, this poll is asking you to think about superior memory. Are some people born with a superior memory so that learning comes easy to them? All right, 60% of you think that this is true. We want this to be true. We really do. And the reason why we want this to be true is that it means we have an excuse. Oh, I'm just not that kind of person. Oh, I just can't learn as well as some people. The truth is that we actually don't have individuals with superior memory. We just have individuals who know how to use their memory well. And this is a common misconception. You can see that when you assess learning myths, about 90% of undergrads think that there's such a thing as photographic memory. Now, perhaps you've seen Rain Man, and there's an individual named Kim Peek who has an extraordinary memory. But he's a savant, so there are individuals in the world who have neurological wiring that is different than the average person. But when it comes to the average person, it's about using your memory and not about being given a specific gift. Okay, let's see if we can go on to the next slide. Before I get into the final stage of my talk today, to summarize things that are foundations in learning, you have to get over misconceptions. So you have to know how we learn correctly. It's important to understand the fundamentals of attention and the fundamentals of memory. And once you do this, you provide a clear pathway for better learning to occur. After teaching for about 10 years, my students would be exasperated, and they'd say, Professor Lassande, we are senior students or junior students. Why is someone telling us to learn now? Why did not someone tell us about memory and how it works earlier on in our education so that we could be implementing these strategies? So students are not aware of this unless they take a specific course. And when you ask them how they learn, we're gonna skip poll 5, actually, and I know you'll be deeply disappointed. But we're actually going to look at a video. This video is when I took some of my research assistants out in the wild at the CSU, and we asked students questions, and you'll see how that goes here.
I just try to follow the study guide online, YouTube.
Flashcards and go over notes.
I kind of just go over my notes for a couple of hours and maybe make some notes.
Usually just study myself. Usually at home these days, like I set my notes and go over my homework. I don't study for too long. I don't pull all-nighters anymore. I just go through it as much as I can. And once I feel confident enough,
I go through my book, and then also if there's a study guide, I go through that and basically just look at key points from those chapters.
And I would highlight a lot of the material, and I would after doing that, I would go through the book and then read the stuff that I highlighted.
There's ways that professors suggested that just did not work for me, so I kind of had to trial and error.
My mom taught me those things. Like she tells me how to. She told me how to concentrate for long periods of time.
I honestly just have been finding my own way to study. I don't really know how to study, but I just do what works best for me.
Not really. It's kind of like teachers have just said, like, make sure you look over your notes, and that's about it. Nobody's really sat down and said, like, this is what you go for.
Okay. That's a very powerful video, I think, of getting a student's earnest reaction of how they learn. And by the way, the gentleman who said his mother taught him how to study is my hero. Having two small boys at home, I can only hope that at some point I've taught them something. Maybe it'll be about learning and memory. When college students were asked, how do you study, in a survey question, we found that 177 students surveyed. The majority, 57%, said that they reread their notes or their chapter. Reread their notes or their chapter. This is the largest, this is the most used study strategy of students, not just here on our campus, but nationwide. We know that some students do recall the chapter, that's about 18%, so they might be asking themselves some questions, which is a really key way of learning, and then 18% do some other stuff, which is like highlighting, making note cards, and so on. All right, looking at that video, coupling the experience that I've had year after year in my psychology classes, I knew that I had to take action. I wanted to develop a method for learning that I aptly call Learn, that I could use to create tools that might not just be for my students, but that could be used more globally. I also was able to implement in the last year a class called Science of Learning for College Student Success. And I've started doing both of these, and I want to finish by giving you both the Learn method and then help you see how you might be able to practice this on your own. When we started the Learn method, I actually asked my colleagues, I have great colleagues, I said, can I go into your intro psychology class and take up 2 class periods to teach you the Learn method and your students? And they said yes, because they trust me. And I went in and I took those 2-hour and 45-minute sessions and tried to give every student what they needed to know about how to effectively learn. Not to my surprise, we asked them, we surveyed, has anyone ever done this before, formally addressed learning? 91% said no. 9% said yes. At the end of the term, now remember, I was only in the classroom twice, we asked them, here were the methods of learning that you were taught during the semester. Have you used any of them? And I was so grateful that almost 60% of the students had used something. And we don't really know what that means, but if you're asking first semester intro students a question and they say yes, it's a good day that they were using this method. All right, so getting right into the method, we have the first tenet is the attention piece. We need people to listen. In order to listen, you have to be a good planner. You have to be prepared to listen. Think of all the things that you sit down to do during a day where you're just not focused. You're not functioning on all cylinders. We also have to know how to be motivated to pay attention. And so when I teach my students about attention, there's a lot of volume to this. One of the ways that I assess their attention is through something called the Attentional Control Scale. And the control scale focuses on 3 things. First, questions that involve your focus. Can you concentrate and limit distracting thoughts? I want you to think of what you were like as a student and how easy it might have been for competitors to get in your way, whether it be students or hunger. And I didn't even have social media to distract me as a student. Have you ever heard the adage that people are great multitaskers? Well, guess what? They're not. In fact, every time you switch to a task, so maybe you're saying that you can be a good meeting attendee while you're texting or while you're using your phone, but you can't. You just don't realize how much that first task suffers. And when you have to get back into the meeting and someone addresses you, you're completely lost. So there's a cost to being a multitasker. And we also need students to be able to demonstrate some sort of control. It is important that students learn. You remember that gentleman who said, my mom taught me how to concentrate for long periods of time. It is a skill. It does not come for free. The E in learn stands for elaborate. So elaborate is not your chatty friend that just talks and talks and talks. We all have one of those. But elaboration is making something that before was not meaningful, rich and full of detail. And what this does is it creates, remember I talked about retrieval, multiple retrieval routes. So it's like that dog looking for 100 Frisbees instead of just one. So the way that we do elaboration is by being detailed. I want you to all go back into one of your general ed classes. Imagine this one is about trees, but think anatomy, physiology, psychology, and you see a definition, a woody perennial plant having a single elongated main stem. That's so boring. If that's your only introduction to a topic, how are you ever going to remember what it is? So when kids are learning about apple orchards or kids are thinking about trees, they don't just stop at one retrieval route. They think of the sound of the leaves of the trees. They learn which kinds of trees keep and shed their leaves, right? And they even do questions. They ask themselves what, when, how, why, and they use rich imagery. All right. The next part of the learn method is to associate, and this really couples well with elaboration. Association is to take context and have a place to put new information. So you're often associating something new with what you already know. I like to think of association using a mnemonic or a memory tool as an anchor. If you can anchor new information with a set of information in memory that you already use day to day, you'll have a better chance of remembering. So if you're an 8-year-old and you're learning math facts, you might be doing so through a Madden NFL game, where now you're doing equations as you learn about passing and catching and so on. So we have programs out there that try to associate learning to make kids have fun, and we want to have fun too as adults. Going back to the name association. Association is a really incredible way to remember names. So now you're at that job interview again, and you have to associate someone's name with something important, or you're not going to remember them. When I ask students to tell me, oh, who's your professor for abnormal psychology? Sometimes they don't know. But what I notice is that when they do remember, they can't pronounce the name. So what this tells us is that the sound of a name is really important. So the first thing you need to do when you're introduced to someone is actually say the name in your mind. That means that you have the initial encoding process. I made up a funny name, Professor Perlwakowski. And how would we associate this? Well, we would break up the word into smaller words. Then we would create an association. And this is absolutely ridiculous. But if you have to remember something and you have little time and energy, you create a bizarre image. A pearl, a cow gleefully skiing down a snow hill with a pearl. Now, hopefully the next time you see that individual, you don't necessarily see the cow with the pearl, but you get what I mean. You associate the information. This is revealed in something called the Baker-Baker paradox. If you meet someone whose last name is Baker, that name comes in and out because it's very conventional. But if you meet someone and they tell you they're a baker, you imagine the sweet bread coming out of the oven, the funny hat, and this is essentially what we need to do with their last name, even if they're not a real baker. All right, we're down to the final pieces of the learn method. So retrieving is really important, and what I found in my teaching with students is they're doing something called simple studying. They're going back, and they aren't trying to retrieve. So they reread their notes, but there's no guarantee that they've actually remembered anything because they haven't brought the Frisbee back. They've done simple studying. So what students need to do is to test themselves. Now I know, you're thinking, we don't need more testing. Don't think of it as testing. Think of it as practice. Students need to ask themselves questions, even if they create them on their own or ask their teacher, or they can just be curious. And this is how we retain knowledge, by accessing it over and over again. So go back to your college self. When I tell my students that I too was not a great studier, I ended up doing well, but I had to learn how to learn as well. So think of all those all-nighters that you may have pulled. When you have an all-nighter and you cram for 5 hours, unfortunately, it actually works. You can remember for about 24 to 48 hours. But if we were really tracking learning, we would throw the outcome of that test away and we would test the people again and again and again. This doesn't happen probably because of time or circumstance. So what we need to do is take our studying and spread it out among several short sessions. Oh my gosh, students groan and moan at this, and so do adults, right? Because that means I have to be planful, I have to change my habit, like exercising, daily, and this is the way that I can reduce my stress in the long run. Okay. So how can educators do this? This is not it's a student's prerogative only. Faculty have to do this too. And in fact, a lot of my students say, Carla, are you telling faculty this? And I'm trying because we all have a lot to learn from each other as faculty. So what can faculty or educators do? They can provide retrieval practice. It can be what we call low stakes. So when you're in the classroom, give a few questions and have people do what's called a minute paper. We have a Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning on campus that will be able to tell you a lot of these things as well. Less content and more quizzing. The day of a midterm and a final need to be over. This puts too much anxiety on students, and it actually sets them up for failure because they have a major cram session a few days before that big exam. Here's what learners can do of all kinds. Don't reread, but quiz. Read a section of information, and instead of wondering what you've read and then going on to the next page, actually write in the margins. I know, God forbid, right? Or write in your notes, what is it that this was about? Create concepts and flashcards. Those are all still good things. Find a partner to study with. Whatever you do, practice the process of retrieval. Okay, so we'll conclude on the last part of the LEARN method, which is, unfortunately, it's not S, but that's not how you spell learn. You spell learn with an N. So when it comes to the final piece for learning, it's all about what you do outside of the classroom that matters, both for students and educators. So you have to utilize your time wisely. You have to know who's there to help you and what resources you have. And you also have to know that sleep is really important. So let's talk about those things. In this graph, this is from a major publisher, Cengage. When college students in the nation were asked what is their barrier toward completing work, the number one thing they say is procrastination. Welcome to the world, college students, right? So when you learn in the class that I teach students how to create a schedule. And at first I tell them, it doesn't have to include everything that you need to do, because you'll fail that way. Put eating, sleeping, and doing a personal activity and start there. Learners also have to understand the pivotal role of mental health. As a psychologist, I feel very fortunate that students can talk to me candidly about anxiety and depression, which is, it rages among all of our college students. The next part about the LEARN method in terms of night is resources. So I'm going to plug all the really great resources that the university has. And the university has had to step up tremendously during the pandemic. And in fact, we have emergency financial grants that you can click on right there to help with cost of living, food insecurity, and even things like if you have a car that's not functioning, you can get money to help you fix that car. If you look at the graph, what you're noticing here is that students underutilize resources. I can't tell you how often students don't know there's a career center. They don't understand about the counseling sessions that they have access to. And so we have to tell them again and again that these are beneficial and they're here for them. Finally, sleep is really important. And we're going to run that final poll to see a question that you probably are asked in other areas of your life. So if you can bring up poll number 6, it's which one of these best represents the amount of sleep that you get each night? All right, what do we have here? So we have the largest bucket says that they are getting between 7 and 8 hours. And you've probably heard this before, so give yourself a pat on the back if you're in this bucket. That's what we want to achieve. And some people need a little bit more, in particular children and adolescents. So if you have these people at home, really make sure that they're getting almost 9 or 10 hours of sleep. Okay. So finishing up, you probably know a lot about sleep, or enough to know that you're supposed to get a maximum of 7 or 8 hours. But maybe you don't know the psychology of sleep. So I won't get into it too much, but I teach my students about what happens when we sleep. We actually have cells in our brain called glial cells, and they're like vacuum cleaners. They suck up matter and neurons that are not functioning properly. During sleep, we actually have a rapid eye movement phase where we're still learning about, but we think a lot of restorative processes happen. My body is relaxed, but my brain is active. You can actually die from sleep deprivation. Okay, we could go to the next slide. So finally, looking at the importance of sleep on memory. We now know that memory is improved during the sleeping process. So sleep has so many fundamental benefits that are restorative, but here's something really interesting. A process called consolidation occurs when you sleep. It's kind of like organizing your refrigerator and throwing out the leftovers that you don't eat. To consolidate means to figure out what you need to use and get rid of the rest. We consolidate memories the night after we learn something. We also consolidate memories after short naps. So taking a nap is okay, just keep it less than 90 minutes, about 20 minutes seems to be the ideal. And final memories, so that long-term memory, some memories are not cemented for months or years. That's why you forget all the political science and anatomy and psychology that you may have learned as a college student. All right, so I hope that I was able to give you a foundation in memory and attention, and I have some resources to finish the talk off with. I'm working with some educators to try to disseminate the LEARN method in a package that's visual and functional for anyone to use, so hopefully I can share more about that again with you. And two other amazing resources are learningscience.org and retrievalpractice.org. And they have great books, so if you want to take something away with you and read more, I would suggest doing that. Finally, this picture was taken of my research team in 2019-20. We were actually eating out at a restaurant before COVID. And this is a picture of them, and also there's a list of the last 3 years of students that have been working with me, and they've contributed in many ways to this work. Thank you very much, and I understand that now we have a little bit of time for questions.
And let me just say thanks very much to Professor Lassande for that outstanding lecture. And just without further ado, if you do have a question, just please remember to submit it in the Q&A function. Thanks.
Our first question in the chat is, some students say they learn better with music playing. Is this possible?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions. We have a disembodied voice. It's actually one of my students, Ellie. I want to thank her for being such a great moderator in the background. You should not listen to music that contains lyrics. So you can listen to music as long as there are not words, because what words do is they take away from your short-term memory capacity, and they essentially get in the way of you thinking and encoding the information you're trying to learn. So only music without lyrics. That's a great question.
Our next question, this person is wondering if and how retrieval planning works for students with ADHD, or in general, how people with ADHD fit in with this topic.
Well, I would disclose that I don't do specific work with ADHD, but what I do know is that the properties of attention apply, and that attention is limited for all humans. It just happens to be more pronounced with individuals with ADHD. Here I would say that the planning process is even more vital. With what we know with children who have attentional disorders is when they go back, imagine you're in a classroom and the teacher says, okay, second graders, take out this book, turn to page 17 in chapter 2. And what happens with so many kiddos is they can't keep all that information in working memory. So the first thing that I would tell people to make sure, is it an attention problem or is it a memory capacity problem? And I would resort to saying that planning is even more vital for people with attentional issues.
Our next question, how can we improve our working memory?
Yeah, we've done some studies on improving working memory, and you can't improve the capacity. You can only improve how effective you are at a particular task. So what happens with most of the cognitive training is that it gets you really good at maybe doing the Sudoku or picking the names and faces within a field of names and faces, but you actually don't transfer that to other tasks. So the best way to improve working memory is to know its limitations and to practice the information that you're trying to learn.
Next question, there has been a recent push to require faculty to test students during finals week. This seems to suggest finals week testing is a bad idea. What would you suggest as a replacement?
That's a yes to that. Okay, here's what you need to do in your final exam. You need to, if you're giving multiple exams, in one of my classes I give 6 exams, and I take a subset of really important information from the first exam and put it on the second. From the second and first, put it on the third and fourth. So by the time they get to the final exam, it is indeed cumulative, but it's not a cumulative exam traditionally where all of a sudden the material just reappears suddenly. They have been given this and paced with it all throughout the semester. So I would suggest something more like this, where you can give yourself the bang for the buck of getting people to really remember information, but if you practice it and you encourage that practice effect with your students, then the final exam becomes really useful.
This is our final question. If you could ask students to do just one thing,
Gives me some time to think.
Yes. Okay. So if you could ask students to do just one thing to positively impact their studies, what would that be?
That's a great question. I was like, one thing. They need to check in with themselves mentally. They need to know, am I able to do this now? And along with that mental check-in, you should think about your mental health at the time, your sleep, your energy, and your focus. But really doing a realistic self-assessment of what you have to give at that particular moment.
Okay, for members of our Zoom audience, if you could please give Dr. Lassande a virtual round of applause, and for our socially distanced audience here, you can yell as loud as you want. So thanks again to Dr. Lassande, and thank you all for joining us today for the 41st Annual Frontier Forum. A recording of today's presentation will be made available on the university website shortly, later in the week, we hope. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.